You know, there's something that's always deeply intrigued me about saints. People look at them as if they were beings from another planet, don't they? As if holiness were some kind of superpower reserved for a handful of chosen ones born different from us. But I guarantee you one thing, after sharing a room with Carlo Acutis, my view on this completely changed. Holiness isn't some impossible thing, my friend. It doesn't live up there in the heights, unreachable, wrapped in mists of mystery. True Christian faith doesn't manifest only in mystical ecstasies or supernatural visions. It's right there, in the routine, in everyday choices, in that moment when you decide between what's right and what's easy. And look, I saw this up close. I saw it in simple gestures, in the way he folded his blanket in the morning, in the spiritual discipline he maintained even when nobody was watching. His religion wasn't for show. It was lived with an authenticity that was almost startling. What left me impressed was precisely this. Carlo didn't need to play the saint. He didn't walk around with an imaginary halo over his head, handing out impressive phrases about spirituality. On the contrary, he played video games, laughed at the same silly jokes any young Christian would laugh at, had his musical preferences, and loved technology. But there was something different about him, something you could feel, but couldn't quite put your finger on. It was as if he carried an inner peace that didn't depend on external circumstances. Prayer for him wasn't that boring thing you do because you have to. It was like breathing, you know, natural, necessary, vital. And that made me question, could it be that holiness isn't exactly that? Could it be that it's simply living the gospel without making a fuss, without personal marketing, without expecting likes and approval for your acts of devotion? Because, you see, many people go to church, give emotional testimonies of faith, participate in worship with fervor, but on Monday, they're a completely different person. So I ask you, what really exists behind the life of a saint? Could it be that rigid, distant, almost unreal image we construct? Or could it be that holiness is something much closer, more concrete and possible than we imagine? Sharing that space with Carlo taught me that the answer lies in the second option. The Bible talks about being the salt of the earth and the light of the world, and I can guarantee you that doesn't mean being perfect or different. It means seasoning ordinary life with eternal purpose, illuminating everyday environments with the living presence of Jesus Christ in you. It's about transforming the ordinary into extraordinary through your way of living. And that, my dear friend, is revolutionary. Because if Carlo achieved it, living in the 21st century, amid technology, social media, video games, and all the distractions of the modern world, imagine what's possible for you and me. Holiness isn't out there far away, unattainable. It's here, within reach of our hands, just waiting for us to choose to live it. And it all began in that room we shared. That room, to be honest, was a silent but eloquent testimony of faith. It wasn't just a space to sleep and store things, you understand? It was like a small sanctuary where spirituality breathed in every corner. And look, I'm not one of those people who sees divine signs everywhere, but there was something special about that room. The simple objects Carlo kept there revealed much more than any sermon could express. There was a Bible by the bed, annotated, underlined, clearly read and reread with devotion. It wasn't the decorative Bible many people have at home, clean, pristine, without signs of use. Carlo's looked like a spiritual treasure map with notes in the margins, dog-eared pages, bookmarks on specific passages. And beside it, there was always a rosary, simple, without extravagant ornaments, but worn from constant use. These were the small details that showed prayer wasn't a special event for him, but a daily practice, an ongoing conversation with God. What caught my attention most was the organization of everything. Nothing was out of place, but there wasn't that artificial rigidity of someone obsessed with perfection either. It was an order that reflected spiritual discipline, yes, but also respect for shared space and for the small things in life. Carlo had religious images, but not in an ostentatious way. They were discreet, strategically placed where he could see them during his devotional moments. And there was something fascinating. He transformed that common space into a sacred place without making it a rule for others. I never felt judged or pressured by his way of living Christianity. On the contrary, I felt invited, inspired to seek my own connection with the divine. Because that's the power of authentic witness. It doesn't impose, it invites. It doesn't criticize, it inspires. He didn't lecture me about how I should organize my side of the room or about my own spiritual practices. His presence, the way he inhabited that space, was already a silent preaching of the gospel. And here's the point many don't understand about Christian life. The environment we create around us speaks louder than our words. Carlo could have filled the walls with posters of Christian music bands or religious motivational phrases, but he didn't. What was there was genuine, personal, real. It was his relationship with Jesus Christ materialized in small objects and habits. And that kind of authenticity, believe me, is contagious. When you share space with someone who truly lives what they believe, without pretensions, without theater, something in you starts to change. You begin to question your own priorities, your own choices. And not because the person is preaching at you, but because coherence of life speaks directly to the heart. That room wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a school of practical faith, where each simple object told a story of devotion, where the presence of the sacred mixed naturally with the everyday, and where religion stopped being theory to become palpable life. Because, look, that's the big question many Christians don't understand. Holiness isn't lived in extraordinary moments. It's built in small daily actions that nobody sees, in choices you make when you're alone, in the discipline you maintain, even when there's no immediate reward. Carlo taught me that without saying a word. He lived faith in a practical, accessible, and transformative way. It wasn't that ethereal, disconnected from reality type of spirituality we see in some religious currents. It was a feet-on-the-ground faith that manifested in concrete actions. For example, he would wake up early to dedicate time to prayer before starting the day's activities. And I'm not talking about 5 rushed minutes asking for blessings. It was substantial time of genuine worship, of reflective Bible reading, of intimate conversation with God. I'd see him, still half asleep, and wonder, how does someone so young have this spiritual discipline? Because let's be honest, most young Christians our age were more concerned about social media than Bible studies. But Carlo was different. He had understood something fundamental. Holiness isn't a state you reach one day, and that's it, mission accomplished. It's a daily construction, made of small decisions, of small yeses to God and small no's to the temptations of the world. When he had the option to stay in bed a few more minutes or get up to pray, he chose to get up. When he could have spent hours wasting time on the internet, he chose to dedicate part of that time to his devotional practices. And look, I'm not saying he was a religious robot without fun. Not at all. Carlo had fun, laughed, enjoyed life like any teenager. But there were clear priorities in his life, and Jesus Christ was at the top of that list. That coherence between faith and daily life was what made his witness so powerful. He didn't preach about holiness in church and live worldly at home. His life was a continuity, a constant flow of faithfulness to the gospel, regardless of context or who was watching. And that's revolutionary. You know why? Because we live in a time when religion has become more a matter of appearances than essence. Many people go to worship on Sunday, participate in praise with enthusiasm, give emotional testimonies, but the rest of the week, it's impossible to distinguish them from any other person who doesn't have faith. Spirituality has become a separate compartment from real life, something we activate at specific moments and deactivate when it's not convenient. Carlo showed me that this is a terrible distortion of true Christianity. Faith must permeate every aspect of our existence, from big decisions to small everyday gestures. It's in how you treat the waiter at a restaurant, in how you react when someone cuts you off in traffic, in how you talk about people when they're not present. Holiness lived in the everyday is exactly that, allowing Christ's character to manifest in every situation, transforming the ordinary into extraordinary through love, patience, kindness, and integrity that flow naturally from a God-centered life. But here's what's most fascinating about all this. Carlo evangelized without opening his mouth to preach. His life was the most eloquent sermon anyone could give. He wasn't one of those Christians who go around distributing religious tracts or approaching people with uncomfortable questions about their eternal salvation. He simply lived his faith with such authenticity, with such coherence, that people naturally felt drawn to ask him about the secret of that inner peace he emanated. And that, my friend, is the most powerful type of evangelization that exists. Because when your life is a living testimony of faith, you don't need to convince anyone of anything. People see in you something different, something they want to have too, and they come to you seeking answers. It's like that phrase attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. Carlo perfectly embodied that principle. His way of living Christianity was so radical in its simplicity, so transformative in its everyday nature, that it ended up being a silent question for everyone who lived with him. I saw how he treated people with genuine respect and kindness. There was no distinction between rich and poor, popular and excluded, Catholics and non-Catholics. Everyone deserved the same love, the same attention, the same respect. And that, in an increasingly fragmented and divided world, was something extraordinary. Carlo didn't participate in gossip, didn't speak ill of anyone, didn't join little groups that formed to exclude others. He was inclusive without even trying to be, because that was the nature of his faith. The gospel he lived wasn't selective, wasn't tribal, wasn't exclusive. It was universal, welcoming, transformative, and people perceived that. Even those who didn't share his religion or spirituality felt comfortable around him, because there was no judgment, no spiritual arrogance, no attitude of moral superiority that unfortunately many Christians exhibit. Carlo was truly humble, not with that false humility that boasts about being humble, and that Christian authenticity was his most effective form of preaching. Because, look, we can fill churches with evangelization programs, growth strategies, elaborate campaigns, but nothing, absolutely nothing, replaces the power of a transformed life that silently testifies to the reality of the gospel. Carlo didn't have a formal ministry, didn't lead groups of young Christians, didn't go up to the pulpit to give elaborate sermons. But his life was a ministry in itself. Every interaction, every decision, every attitude was an opportunity to show the world who Jesus Christ is. And that type of witness crosses barriers that words can't cross. Because people can disagree with your theological arguments, can reject your invitations to go to church, can ignore your Bible quotes, but it's very hard to reject the transformative power of a life that radiates genuine love, peace, and purpose. Authenticity is magnetic. It naturally attracts. And Carlo is authentic to the core. His faith wasn't a superficial veneer. It was the very structure of who he was. And that made all the difference. And speaking of difference, let me tell you about Rajesh. Rajesh was a classmate of ours of Hindu origin, with a religious background completely different from ours. He was the type of brilliant, questioning person who didn't accept easy answers to complex questions. And you know what's interesting? Carlo never tried to convert Rajesh. There was never that uncomfortable pressure, those forced conversations about religion, those attempts to prove Christianity was superior to Hinduism. Carlo was simply friends with Rajesh, a genuine friend who respected him, valued him, and was sincerely interested in him as a person. And it was precisely that authentic friendship, devoid of hidden agenda, that began to open Rajesh's heart to something new. Because Rajesh saw in Carlo something he had never seen in any religious person, a deep joy that didn't depend on external circumstances, a peace that remained even amid academic pressures and the typical anxieties of adolescence. Rajesh began asking questions, not confrontational questions, but genuine questions from someone who really wanted to understand what made Carlo so different. "Why are you so happy?" he asked one day. "Where does that peace you have come from?" And Carlo, with that simplicity that characterized him, shared about his faith, about his personal relationship with Jesus Christ, about how prayer and the Bible were daily sources of strength and direction for his life, but never in an imposing way, never as if he were selling something. It was simply a friend sharing with another friend what was most important in his life. And Rajesh, fascinated by the coherence between belief and life, began investigating on his own. He started reading about Christianity, attending some Bible studies, asking more and more questions. And all because he saw in Carlo a living, joyful, coherent testimony of faith. It wasn't a sermon that touched Rajesh's heart. It was Carlo's life. It was the way he lived his spirituality with such naturalness and joy. And here's the powerful lesson many Christians need to learn. The most effective evangelization isn't the one that shouts the loudest, isn't the one that distributes the most pamphlets, isn't the one that organizes the most elaborate events. It's the one that lives the gospel with such coherence that people naturally want to know more about the source of that transformation. Rajesh eventually converted to Christianity, not because Carlo pressured him, but because he saw in my roommate's life undeniable evidence of the transformative power of faith in Jesus Christ. And that, my friend, is testimonies of faith in their purest form. It's not about statistics. It's not about numbers. It's about lives genuinely transformed by the encounter with Christ, mediated by the silent but powerful witness of someone who lives their religion with authenticity. Rajesh's conversion was just one of many ways Carlo's life impacted the people around him, and all because he understood that evangelizing isn't about what you say, it's about how you live. But what fascinated me most about Carlo was his ability to maintain a perfect balance between being a completely normal young person and having a deeply rooted spirituality. He wasn't the caricature of the holy Christian many people imagine, isolated from the world, living in a religious bubble, rejecting everything modern or technological. Not at all. Carlo loved technology, and he was really good with computers. He created websites, understood programming, was up to date with the latest tech trends. He played video games with the same passion as any teenager his age. He had friends, went out, laughed, enjoyed life. But there was a fundamental difference. None of that took him away from God. He had found a way to integrate his spiritual life with all other aspects of his existence. Technology, which for many becomes an idol that steals time and attention, was for Carlo a tool that could be used to glorify God and serve others. In fact, he used his computer skills to create content about faith, to share biblical teachings, to connect young Christians. It was incredible to see how he transformed his passion for technology into a form of evangelization and worship. There was no dichotomy in his life between the sacred and the secular, between the spiritual and the everyday. Everything was integrated under Christ's lordship. And that spiritual serenity he maintained in the midst of a completely normal, ordinary life, full of activities and interests typical of a teenager, was something extraordinary. Because, let's be honest, many Christians live at one of two extremes. Either they embrace the world so much that their faith becomes irrelevant, or they reject the world so much that their faith becomes strange and disconnected from reality. Carlo found that perfect balance point where he could be fully human and fully consecrated to God at the same time. And that balance is precisely what makes the testimony of faith so powerful and relevant for the contemporary world. Because when people see that it's possible to live a deep spirituality without abandoning normal life, without becoming a religious alien, that becomes attractive, that becomes possible, that becomes attainable. Carlo demonstrated that the gospel doesn't ask you to stop being who you are, but invites you to be the best version of who you can be when you're aligned with God's purpose for your life. He lived Christianity in the midst of routine, in the midst of school assignments, in the midst of friendships, in the midst of his hobbies and passions. Church wasn't the only place where his faith manifested. His faith manifested everywhere at all times, because it had completely permeated his identity. And that wholeness, that completeness, was what made his life so magnetic and his witness so powerful. He didn't preach a theoretical gospel. He preached a lived, incarnate, real gospel. But then came that moment that changed everything. One day, Carlo started feeling unwell. At first, they seemed like common symptoms, nothing too worrying. But the situation deteriorated rapidly. Doctors diagnosed fulminant leukemia, an aggressive type of cancer that advances at a terrifying speed. And I honestly thought that would be the moment when Carlo's faith would truly be put to the test. I thought maybe we'd see fear, questioning, even anger at God. Because, let's be realistic, who wouldn't feel that way receiving such a devastating diagnosis in their teens? But Carlo completely surprised me. His reaction was of a serenity that left me speechless. There was no desperation, no "why me, God?" no bitterness. Instead, Carlo received the news with a peace that can only come from deeply rooted faith. And more than that, he immediately began talking about offering his suffering for the church, for the Pope, for young people who were far from God. I was overwhelmed by that spiritual maturity. Here was a teenager facing his own mortality, and his first reaction wasn't self-pity, but offering. He saw that suffering not as divine punishment or cosmic injustice, but as an opportunity to participate in something greater, to transform pain into intercessory prayer. And that, my friend, is something only very mature faith can produce. Because it's easy to have faith when everything's going well, when life is a bed of roses, when blessings flow abundantly. The real test of faith comes when the storm arrives, when the diagnosis is devastating, when the future you imagine collapses before your eyes. And in that moment, Carlo not only maintained his faith, he deepened it. He clung to Christ with a confidence that taught me more about the gospel than any sermon I had heard. Because look, here's something many Christians don't understand about suffering. It's not something we simply endure until it passes. In the authentic Christian vision, suffering can be transformed into something redemptive, something that participates in Christ's salvific work. Carlo understood that at a level I had never seen in someone so young. He wasn't simply resigned to his illness. He was actively offering every moment of pain, every difficult treatment, every sleepless night, as a living prayer for the church and for souls. It was as if he had grasped something deep about the mystery of the cross, about how God can take even the most painful situations and weave purpose and redemption from them. And that understanding didn't come from abstract theological study. It came from years of daily devotion, of constant prayer, of a genuine relationship with Jesus Christ that had prepared his heart to face even the unimaginable with faith and hope. And what surprised me even more was the awareness Carlo had of his own death. It wasn't naive denial or blind hope in a last-minute miracle. It was a mature acceptance of reality, combined with unshakable faith in eternal life. He knew he would probably die young, and that didn't fill him with terror. On the contrary, there was an almost supernatural peace in the way he talked about death. It wasn't morbid, it wasn't depressive. It was simply realistic, but with eyes fixed on eternity. Carlo understood that this life isn't all there is, that there's something much greater waiting for us on the other side, and that death isn't the end, but the beginning of something infinitely better. That eternal perspective completely changed how he processed his illness. Where others might see only loss and tragedy, Carlo saw transition and hope. I remember a conversation we had in the hospital. He was weak, clearly suffering from the effects of the treatments, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't disappeared. And he told me something I'll never forget. We're all going to die someday. I'm just going first. But I know where I'm going, and that makes all the difference. Those words pierced me like an arrow. Here was a teenager facing his imminent mortality with more courage and clarity than most adults I knew. And that courage didn't come from artificial bravery or denial of reality. It came from radical confidence in Christ, from faith that had been cultivated day after day, prayer after prayer, decision after decision throughout his life. Carlo wasn't afraid to die because he knew in whom he had believed. The Bible says, "Perfect love casts out fear," and I saw that embodied in my friend's life. That spiritual maturity in the face of death isn't common. It's rare, especially in someone so young. But Carlo had lived his relationship with God with such intensity that death wasn't an unknown enemy. It was simply the final step to the definitive encounter with the one he had loved all his life. There were no pending accounts with God, no unresolved matters in his spiritual life. He had lived with such integrity, with such coherence, that he could face eternity with a clear conscience and a peaceful heart. And that, believe me, is a rare gift. Because many people arrive at the end of their lives full of regrets, full of, "if only I had," full of missed opportunities to live according to their deepest values. Carlo had none of that. He had fully lived. He had deeply loved. He had generously served. And now, facing his departure, he could do it with the serenity of someone who knows they lived well and are going to a better place. But even in the midst of his illness, Carlo's witness continued impacting people. In the hospital, he didn't become someone focused only on his own suffering. On the contrary, he paid attention to other patients, to nurses, to doctors. He asked about their lives, was genuinely interested in their stories, offered words of encouragement. There was a nurse who years later recounted that Carlo had been one of the most memorable patients she had cared for, not because of the severity of his condition, but because of the way he radiated peace and love, even in the midst of pain. He transformed the hospital environment with his presence. Other patients asked to visit him because they left his room feeling better, more hopeful, more at peace. How can someone who is dying give hope to others? Only if that person has a source of hope that transcends immediate circumstances. Carlo lived his pain as an occasion for love and worship. Every difficult moment was an opportunity to love more, to trust more, to worship more. It wasn't spiritual masochism. It was a deep understanding that God is present even in suffering, and that this suffering, when offered with love, can have redemptive value. He continued praying, continued reading Bible passages that brought him comfort, continued participating in Christian spirituality, even when his body was failing. His faith didn't depend on feeling good or having perfect health. His faith was an anchor that remained firm regardless of external circumstances. And that deeply impacted everyone who visited him. Because people expected to find a depressed, desperate teenager, perhaps angry at God, and they found someone full of peace, full of gratitude, full of love. And gratitude, yes, that's the word. Carlo was deeply grateful. Grateful for the life he had had, for the family that loved him, for the friends who supported him, for the faith that sustained him. There was no bitterness for what he was losing, only gratitude for what he had received. He understood that each day is a gift, not a right. And that perspective of gratitude transformed even suffering. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" he asked, "How can I use this for God's glory?" And that inversion of perspective, that change of focus, is what makes the difference between suffering that destroys and suffering that transforms. Carlo consciously chose the second option. He allowed his pain to be shaped by his faith. He didn't allow his pain to shape his faith. And that was a powerful lesson for all of us who are witnessing his journey. Carlo's serenity, his inner joy, even in the midst of the storm, wasn't fake. It was genuine, deeply rooted in his concrete spiritual practices. He continued praying even when he was weak. He continued offering his praise to God even when his body screamed with pain. He continued expressing gratitude even when, humanly speaking, there were so many reasons to complain. And these practices weren't just empty rituals. They were real connections with the source of his strength. Each prayer was like drinking from a deep well of divine peace. Each moment of worship was like breathing fresh air in an oppressive environment. Each expression of gratitude was like lighting a light in the darkness. And Carlo knew he needed these practices not as religious obligations, but as lifelines that kept him connected to God in the midst of life's most difficult trial. And here's something many Christians need to learn. Faith that generates peace in the midst of pain isn't automatic. It's cultivated over time in ordinary days, in daily small decisions to seek God, to read the Bible, to pray, to worship. Carlo could maintain his peace during illness because he had built a solid spiritual foundation during his years of health. When the storm came, his spiritual house didn't collapse because it was built on the firm rock of a genuine relationship with Christ. That's the importance of spiritual discipline, of daily devotional time, of constant practices of faith. They're not just religious exercises we do because we're good Christians. They're trainings that prepare our heart to face life's inevitable difficulties with faith and hope. Carlo was spiritually prepared for his battle with leukemia long before receiving the diagnosis. And that preparation made all the difference. Because look, when you arrive at a spiritual crisis unprepared, when you face deep suffering without having a solid faith foundation, the result can be devastating. Many people lose their faith in such moments, or become bitter, or develop a distorted vision of God. But when you arrive at a crisis with a strong spiritual base, built over years of faithfulness, you can face the storm without losing your anchor. Carlo knew who God was not only theoretically, but experientially. He had walked with God in good days, so he knew he could trust God in bad days. He had seen divine faithfulness in small things, so he could trust that faithfulness in big things. And that trust wasn't blind. It was informed by years of relationship, years of witness, years of seeing God acting in his life. Carlo's peace in the midst of suffering was the ripe fruit of a life of constant devotion. But the story didn't end with Carlo's death. In fact, in many ways, it was only beginning. After his departure, testimonies began emerging from people who had been impacted by his life. But more than that, reports of miracles began appearing, of inexplicable healings attributed to his intercession. People who prayed asking for Carlo's intercession and experienced healings that doctors couldn't explain. Deep conversions of people who had been far from God and who, after learning Carlo's story, decided to return to faith. It was as if his mission on earth hadn't ended with his physical death. In some mysterious way, he continued impacting lives, continued bringing people to Christ, continued being God's instrument to touch hearts. And that's not only beautiful, it's theologically significant. It shows that the communion of saints, that sometimes misunderstood doctrine, is something real and powerful. The testimonies of faith that emerged after Carlo's death were impressive. Parents who had lost hope in their sick children's recovery, who prayed asking for his intercession and saw inexplicable improvements. Young people who were on destructive paths, involved in drugs or lifestyles that were destroying them, who learned Carlo's story and felt a call to change radically. People who were on the verge of suicide, plunged in deep depression, who found in Carlo's life testimony a reason to continue, a renewed hope. It was extraordinary to see how a life lived with such integrity, though brief in years, could have such a broad and lasting impact. Carlo had understood something fundamental. It's not the length of your life that matters, it's the depth with which you live it. He lived his few years intensely, and that multiplied into spiritual fruits that continue to this day. And the miracles weren't only physical. There were miracles of interior transformation, of restored families, of healed relationships. People who had been in conflict with their parents for years, who after praying asking for Carlo's intercession, felt their hearts soften to seek reconciliation. Marriages on the verge of divorce that found new hope and new connection. Addicts who found freedom after years of bondage. It was as if Carlo from heaven was continuing his ministry of silent but powerful testimony of faith, and the church began taking notice. The beatification process began, that formal path by which the Catholic Church recognizes a person's holiness. And each step of that process revealed more and more the depth of Carlo's spiritual life, the authenticity of his faith, the lasting impact of his witness. His legacy was only beginning. But perhaps one of the most striking moments of this entire story was the exhumation of Carlo's body. Years after his death, when his body was exhumed as part of the beatification process, Those present were astonished by what they found. His body was preserved in a way that science couldn't completely explain. It wasn't artificial mummification or sophisticated embalming. It was something different, something many interpreted as a spiritual sign. Now, I know there's skepticism about these things, and it's okay to have questions. But what can't be denied is the devotional impact that had. Thousands of people who saw Carlo's preserved body felt their faith strengthened, felt a spiritual awakening, felt a call to live their own Christianity with more integrity. It was as if even physically, Carlo continued testifying about the reality of eternal life, about God's power to preserve what is consecrated to Him. The phenomenon of incorruptible bodies of saints has a long history in Christianity, and it always generates debate. But regardless of how one interprets the phenomenon scientifically, the spiritual impact is undeniable. For many devotees, seeing Carlo's preserved body was like receiving a tangible confirmation that his life had been truly exceptional, genuinely holy. It was an encouragement to faith, a reminder that God can do extraordinary things, a call to seek holiness in one's own life. And that is, ultimately, the purpose of saints in Christian tradition, not to be admired from afar as unreachable figures, but to serve as models and intercessors who call us to follow the same path of faithfulness to Christ. The preservation of Carlo's body became a pilgrimage point, a place where people from around the world came to pray, to reflect, to renew their commitment to faith. And the impact continued growing. Young Christians from around the world began seeing in Carlo a model of how to live faith in the 21st century. He wasn't a medieval saint, distant from our reality. He was a teenager like any other, who faced the same temptations, the same pressures, the same distractions young people face today. But he chose a different path. He chose to place Jesus Christ at the center of his life, not as a separate compartment, but as the integrating reality that gave meaning to everything else. And that example was extremely powerful, especially for a generation that often sees religion as something irrelevant, outdated, disconnected from real life. Carlo demonstrated that authentic Christian spirituality isn't just relevant, but it's the most relevant thing that can exist. It gives purpose, direction, meaning, peace. It transforms the ordinary into extraordinary. It makes life not just an existence, but an adventure with eternal meaning. Carlo's spiritual legacy can be summarized in a few central elements that defined his life and continue inspiring millions. First, his devotion to the Eucharist. For Carlo, communion wasn't just a religious ritual. It was the most intimate encounter with Christ, the source and summit of his Christian life. He attended Mass daily when he could, not out of obligation, but from genuine desire to be close to Jesus. And that centrality of the Eucharist in his spirituality was what fueled everything else. It was from that sacramental encounter that his peace, his joy, his love for others flowed. Carlo understood something many Christians still need to discover: the importance of sacraments, of those moments of grace where God becomes tangibly present. His sacramental life wasn't empty formalism. It was the root from which the abundant fruit of his holiness flowed. Second, his life of constant prayer. Carlo didn't only pray at established times. He cultivated a constant awareness of God's presence, transforming his entire life into prayer. That practice of God's presence, as the ancient mystics called it, was what kept his heart aligned with the Father's heart. He conversed with God while walking, while studying, while playing. God wasn't an occasional visitor in his life. He was the constant companion, the permanent presence. And that intimacy with the divine was what gave depth to his entire existence. Third, his commitment to evangelization by example. Carlo had understood that the best way to bring people to Christ isn't through elaborate arguments or eloquent sermons, but through a life that radiates Christ's presence. Every action, every word, every decision was an opportunity to witness about the gospel. And that silent but powerful witness continues speaking today, years after his death. Because in the end, what is holiness? It's not impeccable perfection. It's not a life without struggles or temptations. Holiness is constant faithfulness. It's getting up every time you fall. It's choosing God again and again, even when it's difficult. It's living with eyes fixed on Christ, allowing Him to transform every aspect of your existence. It's loving without measure, serving without expecting reward, forgiving without limits. It's finding joy in the midst of suffering, peace in the midst of the storm, hope in the midst of darkness. Carlo lived all that, not because he was special in the sense of being different from us, but because he chose to make Christ his everything. And that's a choice we can all make. You don't need to be a religious genius or have extraordinary mystical experiences. You only need to decide each day to place Jesus Christ at the center of your life and live the consequences of that decision with faithfulness. Carlo's legacy shouts to us that holiness is possible, that it's accessible, that it's within reach of each one of us. We only need to have the courage to say yes to that call and walk that path with perseverance, trusting that the one who began the good work in us will bring it to completion.